She was born into a family that would eventually become one of the most recognizable households in reality television. Before she was old enough to understand what fame meant, Hannah Gosselin was already being filmed, photographed, and watched by millions of people. Viewers knew her as one of 8 children in the Gosselin family. They watched the matching clothes, the family outings, the birthdays, the arguments, the routines, and the carefully organized chaos that made Jon and Kate plus 8 such a huge success. But growing up inside a television show is very different from watching one from the other side of the screen. Now an adult, Hannah has spoken about parts of that childhood that audiences never saw, offering a very different perspective on what life inside the Gosselin household could feel like once the cameras were no longer simply entertainment and had become part of everyday life. Hannah Gosselin was born on May 10, 2004, in Hershey, Pennsylvania. She was one of the sextuplets born to Jon and Kate Gosselin, alongside Colin, Alexis, Aiden, Leah, and Joel. The family also included older twin daughters, Cara and Maddie. From the beginning, the Gosselin household was extraordinary. 8 children meant an enormous amount of planning, organization, and responsibility, and the family's unusual circumstances eventually attracted the attention of television producers. When Jon and Kate plus 8 premiered in 2007, Hannah was only 3 years old. She was too young to understand why cameras were suddenly everywhere, or why ordinary family moments were becoming television content. For her, being filmed was not something that happened after childhood had already begun. It was simply part of childhood. To viewers, the program offered a highly organized version of family life. Kate was known for her strict schedules and meticulous organization, while Jon often appeared as the more relaxed parent. The children became familiar faces, and audiences followed their development from toddlers into teenagers. The program presented birthdays, vacations, school activities, family disagreements, celebrations, and countless everyday moments. But reality television is never literally every moment of reality. Producers select footage, editors shape scenes, and hours of real life have to be reduced into episodes that fit a particular story. That distinction becomes especially important when the people being filmed are children who have little control over how their lives are presented. As the show became increasingly successful, the Gosselin family transformed from a private household into a national phenomenon. Their faces appeared in magazines and television interviews, and their family life became a subject of constant public discussion. What happened inside the home could suddenly become entertainment for millions of strangers. At the same time, Jon and Kate's marriage was deteriorating. Their relationship eventually reached a breaking point, and in 2009, they divorced. The separation itself became part of the public story surrounding the family, and the television program continued under the title Kate plus 8. For the children, however, this was not simply a television storyline. Their parents were separating in real life. They were still children trying to understand what was happening while cameras continued recording their family. Hannah was only 5 when the divorce became official. She was old enough to recognize that something fundamental had changed, but far too young to understand all of the adult circumstances surrounding it. The family that millions of viewers had followed as a single unit was beginning to split into different households, different relationships, and eventually different versions of the same family story. The most complicated part of Hannah's story involves her brother Colin. During childhood, Colin was treated differently from his siblings, according to accounts he and Hannah later gave. Hannah has described witnessing her brother being separated from the other children and excluded from parts of ordinary family life. Colin himself later made much more detailed allegations about his childhood treatment. Those allegations have been disputed by Kate Gosselin, who has maintained that Colin had significant behavioral and psychiatric problems, and that decisions involving his care were made because of those concerns. Because the accounts differ sharply, it is important to distinguish between what has been documented and what remains disputed. Colin has said that he was isolated from his siblings and that a room was created in the family's basement where he was confined. In later interviews, he described the room as having a mattress, a small window, cameras, and a lock that could be operated from outside. He also alleged that he was sometimes restrained. These are serious allegations made by Colin about his childhood. not facts that have been independently established in every detail. Kate has rejected the characterization of her actions as abuse and has defended the decisions surrounding Colin's treatment as responses to his behavioral and mental health difficulties. People.com. For Hannah, the significance of these events was not simply what happened to her brother. It was what she experienced as a child watching someone she loved become increasingly separated from the rest of the family. A young child does not necessarily have the vocabulary to understand complicated family dynamics, medical decisions, custody disputes, or parental conflict. But children can recognize absence. They can recognize when someone is no longer sitting at the table, joining an activity, or appearing in the same rooms as everyone else. Hannah has described the experience of seeing Colin separated from the family as something that stayed with her. The Gosselin children's lives also changed dramatically after the divorce. Custody arrangements and family relationships became increasingly complicated. Hannah eventually began spending more time with her father, Jon. In 2018, she moved to living with him, a development that received significant media attention. Contemporary reporting described Hannah as living with Jon by that year, while the custody dispute surrounding the children continued. Us Weekly. The change was significant because Hannah had spent most of her childhood under her mother's household structure. Moving to her father's home gave her a different daily environment. She was no longer living under the same arrangements that had defined much of her childhood. And while the move did not magically erase everything that had happened before, it gave her an opportunity to experience adolescence in a way that felt more ordinary. At the same time, the family division came with a painful cost. The 8 children were no longer growing up together in the same household. Some remained with Kate, while Hannah and eventually Colin lived with Jon. The siblings therefore experienced the same childhood from increasingly different positions. Their memories were shaped by where they lived, which parent they were closest to, and what they personally experienced. That helps explain why members of the Gosselin family have sometimes offered dramatically different accounts of their childhood. Hannah did not immediately become a public critic of her mother. In fact, for years she largely stayed away from the public conflict. That silence is important. She had grown up watching private family issues become public entertainment. So she understood better than most people that speaking publicly could create another cycle of headlines. Rather than constantly discussing the family dispute, she built a life away from the television program that had made her famous. Then came 2023. Hannah appeared in the Vice television documentary series Dark Side of the 2000s, in an episode examining Jon and Kate plus 8 and the world surrounding the Gosselin family. Her appearance gave audiences a rare opportunity to hear directly from one of the children who had actually lived through the experience of being filmed. Instead of simply repeating the image viewers remembered from television, Hannah discussed what she remembered about growing up inside the family. Her perspective was particularly significant because she did not present the story as a simple battle between a good parent and a bad parent. She acknowledged that her family circumstances were extremely difficult. Raising 8 children is difficult under ordinary circumstances, and doing so while dealing with a collapsing marriage and intense public attention created pressures that most families never experience. But acknowledging those pressures does not automatically erase the impact those circumstances may have had on the children. Hannah's account also brought attention back to the larger question surrounding reality television. What happens when children become part of a commercial entertainment product before they are old enough to understand what that means? Adults can sign contracts, make career decisions, and decide how much of their private lives they want to expose. Young children cannot make those decisions in the same way. They grow up inside decisions made by other people, and only years later can they begin to understand how those choices affected them. That question becomes even more complicated when the family itself becomes famous. Once millions of viewers have formed an opinion about a child, that child eventually has to grow up while carrying an identity that was created partly by television. Hannah was not simply Hannah. For years, she was one of the Gosselin kids. Her childhood images were archived online, replayed on television, discussed by strangers, and remembered by people who had never actually met her. Colin's later interviews added another dimension to that story. In 2024, he publicly described allegations about his childhood treatment in far greater detail. He said he had been isolated and confined in a basement room and alleged that cameras were used to monitor him. He also said that he had been treated differently from his siblings and that these experiences began when he was young. Us Weekly. Again, these claims must be understood as Colin's account. Kate Gosselin has denied allegations of abuse and has maintained that Colin had behavioral and psychiatric issues that influenced decisions about his care. Her position represents a fundamentally different explanation of what happened. People.com. The custody history surrounding Colin is nevertheless documented. In 2018, Jon sought full legal and physical custody of his son after Colin had spent time in an inpatient program. In December of that year, Jon was awarded sole physical and legal custody of Colin after Kate and her attorney did not appear at the scheduled hearing. Colin was subsequently released from the program and went to live with Jon. Us Weekly. For Hannah and Colin, living with their father represented more than a legal change. It meant entering a different household after years of highly publicized family conflict. Their lives were no longer structured around the television program in the same way. The cameras that had followed them through childhood were no longer defining their daily existence. And that may be one of the most revealing details in Hannah's story. When someone grows up surrounded by cameras, privacy can become something that feels unusual. A quiet meal, an ordinary school day, an argument that nobody records, a friendship that never becomes part of a television storyline. These things may sound completely normal to most people. But for a child whose family life was repeatedly documented, normality can become something valuable. Hannah eventually began building an identity separate from the television show. She completed high school and began pursuing interests outside the Gosselin family's reality TV legacy. She also continued to maintain relationships with some of her siblings. Although the family divisions created by years of custody disputes and estrangement made those relationships complicated. The Gosselin children entered adulthood carrying very different relationships with their parents and with one another. Some remained closer to Kate. Others became closer to Jon. Some avoided public discussion altogether. The result was not one unified family narrative, but several competing memories of the same childhood. That is why Hannah's story is more complicated than a simple daughter exposes mother headline. She has not presented her past as an easy story with a villain and a hero. Her relationship with her mother has been complicated by both affection and painful memories. She can recognize that Kate was her mother and still acknowledge that certain experiences hurt her. Those two realities can exist at the same time. The same complexity appears in the public disagreement surrounding Colin. His allegations have been supported by some family members and rejected by others. His sister, Mady, has publicly defended Kate and offered a different account of Colin's behavior and the family circumstances. Jon, meanwhile, has supported Colin's version of events in important respects. This means the public is not looking at one uncontested family record. It is looking at a deeply divided family in which different members remember and interpret the past differently. That distinction matters because reality television trained audiences to believe they knew the Gosselin family. Viewers saw arguments. They saw routines. They saw vacations. They saw children growing up. But television footage can never provide the complete context of a person's life. There are conversations that happen when cameras are absent. There are emotions that never make an episode. There are private conflicts that editors never show. And there are childhood experiences that children themselves may not understand until many years later. Hannah's adulthood has therefore become an opportunity to reconsider the original program from a different perspective. The little girl viewers once watched on television is now old enough to tell parts of her own story. She can look back at the episodes, the family dynamics, the divorce, the custody battles, and the years of public attention with an understanding she simply did not possess as a child. And perhaps that is the most important transformation of all. As a child, Hannah was part of someone else's story. As an adult, she gets to decide what her own story means. She did not choose to be born into a famous family. She did not choose for cameras to document her childhood. She did not choose to become part of a television franchise that would remain available to the public years after the original episodes aired. But she can choose what she does with those experiences now. Her story also raises a larger question about the children who grew up on reality television during the 2000s. Many of those children are adults today. They can look back at footage that was filmed when they were too young to understand what fame, contracts, ratings, and public exposure meant. Some have embraced their childhood fame. Others have rejected it. Still others are somewhere in between. The Gosselin family became famous because viewers were fascinated by the idea of seeing a large family navigate everyday life. But years later, the children themselves became part of a much bigger conversation. Whether children should have the same protections as adults when their private lives become entertainment. Hannah's experience does not provide a universal answer to that question, but it demonstrates why the question matters. A child can smile for a camera and still be unhappy. A family can look organized on television while struggling privately. A reality show can document thousands of hours of someone's life while still leaving out the moments that matter most. And a person can love a parent while still being hurt by that parent. Those contradictions are difficult to package into a 30-minute television episode. They are even harder to reduce to a headline. But real families rarely fit neatly into simple stories. Hannah Gosselin's journey is ultimately not only about Jon, Kate, Colin, or the television show that made the family famous. It is about what happens when childhood becomes public property and adulthood finally gives someone the opportunity to take ownership of their own narrative. The little girl viewers once watched grow up on television is now an adult who can decide which parts of that childhood she wants to discuss, which parts she wants to leave private, and what kind of relationship she wants with the people from her past. And perhaps the most striking part of her story is that she does not appear to need the same thing the television audience once needed. She does not need everything to have a perfect ending. She does not need every family member to agree on what happened. She does not need to turn her mother into a monster or her father into a hero. She simply has the right to remember her childhood from her own perspective. That is what makes Hannah's story so compelling.